When a billionaire worth over $300 million told his driver he was dying, nobody knew it was all a lie. Not his family, not his lawyers, not even the doctors who signed the fake medical reports. But what that lie revealed would shatter everything he thought he knew about loyalty, about wealth, and about the man who had driven him silently for 15 years. By the time he learned the truth, it was already too late to undo the test. And what his driver did when no one was watching left him sobbing in a room he thought no amount of money could ever fill. This is the story of Richard Cole, a 68-year-old real estate magnate who built an empire from nothing. Skyscrapers across 3 states bore his name. Politicians returned his calls. Charities fought for his donations. But behind the boardrooms and the black cars and the gated mansions, Richard was alone. His wife Margaret had died 6 years earlier from a stroke, and their 3 children had scattered like dust in the wind. One lived in Paris, barely calling. Another was tangled up in legal disputes over money Richard refused to give him. The third had stopped speaking to him altogether after a bitter argument about inheritance. Richard had everything except the one thing money couldn't buy: trust. He didn't trust his children. He didn't trust his business partners. He didn't even trust the people who smiled at him during charity galas. Everyone wanted something. Everyone had a price, or so he believed. But there was one man Richard had never questioned: David Miller, 42 years old, father of 2, his driver for the past 15 years. David was the kind of man who said good morning even when you didn't respond, the kind who remembered your favorite coffee order and kept mints in the glove box because you once mentioned you liked them. Quiet, humble, almost invisible in the way loyal people often are. Richard had watched David raise his kids on a driver's salary, watched him decline tips from business associates who tried to bribe him for inside information, watched him work double shifts without complaint when Richard needed him. And yet, in the lonely silence of his mansion, Richard found himself asking the question that would lead to everything. If I were dying, would David stay because he cared, or because he was waiting for something more? That question festered. It grew. And one cold October morning, Richard decided to find out. He would fake his own terminal illness. He would pretend to be dying. And he would watch, through hidden cameras and carefully orchestrated moments, to see if the one man he thought he could trust would reveal his true nature when the stakes were highest. It was a cruel plan, a desperate plan. But Richard Cole had spent decades reading people, testing them, exposing their greed, and he convinced himself this was no different. He told his lawyer, he told his private doctor, he had the medical documents forged, and then on a gray Wednesday afternoon, he called David into his study and told him the lie that would change both their lives forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard sat behind his mahogany desk, hands folded, face drawn and pale from makeup applied earlier that morning. David stood near the door, cap in hand, concern already flickering in his eyes. "Sir, are you all right? You look pale." Richard let the silence hang for a moment, then spoke in a voice he made sound weaker than it was. "David, I need to tell you something. Something I haven't told anyone else yet. Not my children, not even my closest advisors." The room felt smaller. David stepped forward. "What is it, sir?" Richard looked down at his hands, a performance he had rehearsed in the mirror. "I'm sick, David. Very sick. The doctors say I have pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. They're giving me 3, maybe 4 months." David's face crumbled. His mouth opened but no words came. His eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. Richard watched him carefully, cataloging every micro-expression, every breath. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I don't even know what to say. Is there anything they can do? Treatments? Anything?" Richard shook his head slowly. "It's too late for that. I'm preparing my affairs, my will, my estate. I wanted you to know because you've been more than just an employee to me, David. You've been family, and I need someone I can trust in these final months. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, nodding as if trying to convince himself this wasn't real. "I'll be here, sir. Whatever you need. I'm not going anywhere." Richard felt a flicker of something he didn't expect. Guilt. But he pushed it down. This was necessary. He needed to know. Over the next few days, Richard began his act in earnest. He moved slower, ate less, spent more time in bed. He told his household staff about the diagnosis, swearing them to secrecy from his children until he was ready. He installed small cameras in the corners of rooms where David often waited, in the garage where he parked the car, even in the hallways outside Richard's bedroom. He wanted to see everything. Meanwhile, David's behavior began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. He started arriving earlier, sometimes 30 minutes before his shift, just to check on Richard. He would ask the housekeepers if Richard had eaten, if he seemed comfortable, if there was anything more he could do. He stopped accepting lunch breaks, saying he wanted to be available if Richard needed him. One afternoon, Richard overheard David on the phone in the garage. His voice was strained. "Honey, I know things are tight. I know the furnace needs fixing, but I can't leave him right now. He's dying. I just can't." Richard listened from the hallway, hidden, watching through the lens of a camera he'd placed above the doorframe. David hung up and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, head in his hands. Richard returned to his study and replayed the footage later that night. He told himself it was just an act, that David was playing the part of the loyal servant because he knew there might be something in it for him later. People were good at playing roles when money was involved, but doubt crept in. A week later, Richard staged his first major test. He left an envelope on his desk containing $5,000 in cash, paper-clipped with a note written in shaky handwriting that read, "For household expenses, ask David to handle." He told the housekeeper to give it to David while he was supposedly resting upstairs. The cameras rolled. David opened the envelope in the kitchen. He stared at the money for a long time. Then he folded the envelope, placed it in his jacket pocket, and walked upstairs. Richard, watching from a monitor in his bedroom, felt his pulse quicken. Here it comes, he thought. The moment of truth. David knocked softly. "Sir? May I come in?" Richard, lying in bed with the lights dimmed, waved him in weakly. David approached the bedside and carefully pulled the envelope from his pocket. "Sir, the housekeeper gave me this. You wrote that it's for household expenses, but I wanted to make sure you actually meant for me to handle it and that this wasn't a mistake. Because this is a lot of money." Richard, genuinely surprised, nodded slowly. "Yes, I trust you with it. Use it where it's needed." David hesitated, then placed the envelope on the nightstand. "Sir, with all respect, I think you should have your accountant handle this. I don't feel right carrying this kind of cash. If something happens to it, I'd never forgive myself. I can pick up groceries, pay the utility bills from your account with your approval, but I don't want to be responsible for this. Please." Richard stared at him. The script he had written in his mind for this moment shattered. He had expected David to pocket the money, to skim a little, to test the waters, but David had handed it back. Not because he was scared of being caught, but because he didn't feel right taking responsibility for it. After David left, Richard sat alone in the dim room, staring at the envelope on the nightstand. For the first time since the plan began, he felt something unfamiliar. Shame. As the days turned into weeks, Richard's fake illness became harder to maintain, not because of the physical act, but because of what he was witnessing. David's care was relentless. He began bringing Richard homemade soup his wife made, saying she insisted on it even though money was tight at home. He started keeping a notebook in his jacket pocket where he wrote down things Richard mentioned in passing, medications he needed, preferences for temperature in the car, even the names of old friends Richard said he missed. One evening, Richard, feeling a strange need to push the test further, told David he was revising his will and that he wanted David to be present when the lawyer came. David looked uncomfortable. "Sir, that's really not my place. That's family business." Richard, lying in his chair by the window, looked at him with genuine curiosity. "You've been more present than my family, David. I think you've earned the right to know what I'm planning." David shook his head gently. "With respect, sir, I don't need to know. I'm here because I care about you, not because of what you're leaving behind. That's not my business. It never was." Richard felt his chest tighten. He dismissed David for the evening and sat alone in the growing dark, replaying the words in his mind. "I'm here because I care about you, not because of what you're leaving behind." Could it really be that simple? Could loyalty exist without expectation? He began reviewing the footage obsessively. He watched David in the garage, sitting alone during his breaks, praying quietly with his hands folded. He watched him wipe down the car even when it didn't need cleaning, as if keeping it pristine was a way of honoring Richard. He watched him pause outside Richard's door at night before leaving, as if making sure there was no sound of distress before he went home to his own family. And then came the moment that broke Richard. It was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into the fake illness. Richard had told David he was too tired to eat and sent him home early. But the camera in the hallway captured what happened next. David didn't leave. He stood outside Richard's door for almost 5 minutes, debating with himself. Then he quietly walked back downstairs, asked the cook if there was any broth or soup left, and brought a thermos back upstairs. He knocked softly. "Sir, I know you said you weren't hungry, but I brought something light just in case. I'll leave it outside the door. You don't have to eat it now. Just when you're ready." Lying in bed, heard the soft clink of the thermos being set down. He heard David's footsteps retreat. He waited until the house was quiet, then opened the door. The thermos was still warm. There was a note tucked under it, written in David's careful handwriting. "You're not alone, sir, even when it feels like you are." Richard stood in the hallway, holding that note, and for the first time in years he cried. Not the polite tears of a funeral or the calculated emotion of a business negotiation. Real, raw tears that came from a place he thought had died with his wife. He had spent 3 weeks trying to catch David in a moment of greed, of selfishness, of human weakness, and all he had caught was a man who cared, a man who stayed, a man who, despite having every reason to walk away, chose to remain. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He would end the test. He would confess. And he would face whatever came next. Richard arranged to meet David in his study on a Saturday afternoon when the house was quiet. He had dismissed the staff for the day. The cameras were still rolling, but this time Richard didn't care what they captured. He needed to come clean. David arrived exactly on time, as always, dressed in his usual neat button-down shirt and slacks. He looked worried. "Sir, is everything all right? You sounded serious on the phone." Richard gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, David, please." David sat, hands folded in his lap, eyes full of concern. Richard took a long breath. He had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his mind, but now that it was here, the words felt impossible. "David, I need to tell you something. Something I'm not proud of. The past few weeks, everything I've told you about being sick, it was a lie." David's face went blank. "What?" Richard pushed forward, the words coming faster now, as if saying them quickly would make them hurt less. "I'm not dying. There's no cancer. I faked the entire thing. The medical reports, the symptoms, all of it. I did it because I wanted to test you. I wanted to see if you would stay loyal or if you would take advantage of the situation. I installed cameras. I watched you. I tested you with money, with access, with trust. And I'm telling you now because I can't keep lying." David sat completely still. His expression didn't change. He just stared at Richard as if trying to process words in a foreign language. Richard continued, his voice breaking now. "I know how terrible this sounds. I know what I did was cruel. But I've been burned so many times, David, by people I thought I could trust. My own children barely speak to me unless they need something. Business partners have stolen from me. Friends have betrayed me. I didn't know who to trust anymore. And you were the one person I thought might be different. But I needed to know. I needed to be sure. The silence in the room was suffocating. David's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been folded calmly, now gripped the arms of the chair. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, but there was a tremor beneath it. You thought I was like them. Richard felt the words like a punch. I didn't know. I just needed to be sure. David stood up slowly, and for a moment, Richard thought he might walk out and never come back. But David didn't leave. He stood there, looking down at Richard with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was disappointment. For 15 years, sir, I drove you everywhere. I listened when you needed someone to talk to. I kept your secrets. I watched you grieve your wife, and I never asked for anything in return. And you thought that if you pretended to die, I'd what? Steal from you? Ask for money? Try to get in your will? Richard opened his mouth to respond, but David wasn't finished. I knew, sir. His voice cracked. I knew you weren't really sick. Richard's heart stopped. What? David wiped his eyes quickly, but the tears came anyway. I've driven you to enough real doctor's appointments over the years to know what a sick man looks like, the way you moved when you thought no one was watching, the way you still had energy to argue with your lawyer on the phone. I knew something wasn't right. But I didn't say anything because I thought maybe you needed to do this for some reason I didn't understand. And I stayed anyway, because I care about you, not because of your money, not because I thought I'd get something out of it, but because after 15 years, you're not just my boss. You're someone I respect, someone I thought respected me too. Richard felt his throat close. The room spun. David, I'm so sorry. David shook his head, his voice breaking completely now. Do you know what it's like to go home every night and tell my wife that I can't fix the furnace because I need to be there for a man who's pretending to die just to see if I'll steal from him? Do you know what it's like to pray every night that you'd find peace, even though I knew you were lying? I stayed because I thought you were alone. I stayed because I thought you needed someone. But you didn't need someone. You needed a test subject. Richard stood, reaching out, but David stepped back. I don't know if I can keep doing this, sir. I don't know if I can keep working for someone who thinks so little of me. And with that, David turned and walked out of the study. Richard stood frozen, listening to the sound of the front door closing. The house fell silent. And for the first time in decades, Richard Cole, billionaire, empire builder, master of men, felt completely and utterly powerless. For 3 days, David didn't come to work. Richard called him twice, but both calls went to voicemail. He didn't leave messages. What could he possibly say? The house felt larger without David's presence. The other staff moved quietly, efficiently, but there was no warmth, no familiarity. Richard realized, perhaps for the first time, how much David had been the heartbeat of his daily life. On the 4th day, Richard's lawyer, Martin, arrived for a scheduled meeting. Martin had been in on the test from the beginning, and he had watched the fallout with quiet concern. Richard, I think you need to know something. Richard looked up from his desk, exhausted. What now? Martin placed a folder on the desk. It's about David. Richard's chest tightened. What about him? Martin opened the folder and slid a bank statement across the desk. Over the past 6 months, David has been making monthly donations to a children's charity, the orphanage on Maple Street. Richard frowned. So? He's a good man. I already knew that. Martin shook his head. You don't understand. Look at the amounts. Richard scanned the statement. The donations were small, $50 here, $75 there, but they were consistent. Every single month. Richard looked up, confused. I still don't understand. Martin leaned forward. Richard, those donations were made in your name. Richard's breath caught. What? Martin nodded. David's been telling the orphanage that the donations are from you. He's been using his own money, but attributing them to you because he said, and I quote, Mr. Cole has always cared about children who don't have families. I want to make sure his legacy reflects that, even if he doesn't know about it." Richard felt the room tilt. When did he start doing this? Martin checked his notes. "About 3 months before you started the fake illness. He's been doing it on his own, without telling anyone. I only found out because the orphanage director called my office last week to thank you personally for the consistent support. She wanted to arrange a meeting. I looked into it and discovered it was David." Richard sat back in his chair, the weight of it crushing him. "He's been giving his own money, in my name, while I was testing whether he'd steal from me." Martin's expression was gentle but firm. "Richard, I've known you for 30 years. I've seen you build an empire, but I've never seen you more wrong about someone than you were about David. That man doesn't have a greedy bone in his body, and you broke his heart." Richard covered his face with his hands. "What do I do, Martin? How do I fix this?" Martin stood gathering his papers. "I don't know if you can, but if you're going to try, you'd better be prepared to do more than apologize. You're going to have to show him that you've changed, that you understand what you did, and that might take more than words." After Martin left, Richard sat alone in his study for hours. He thought about his wife, Margaret. She had always been the one who could see people clearly, who trusted easily, who loved without conditions. She would have seen David's goodness immediately. She would have been ashamed of what Richard had done. And in that moment, Richard made a decision. He would make this right, no matter what it took. Richard drove himself to David's house the next morning. It was the first time in years he'd been behind the wheel. The house was small, a modest single-story home with a chain-link fence and a lawn that needed mowing. Richard parked on the street and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. He knocked on the door. David's wife, Linda, answered. Her expression was cautious. "Mr. Cole." "Hello, Linda. I know I probably shouldn't be here, but I need to speak with David." "Is he home?" Linda hesitated, then nodded. "He's in the garage. But Mr. Cole, he's really hurt. Please don't make it worse." "I won't. I promise." Linda stepped aside and Richard walked through the small, warmly decorated home. Photos of David's kids covered the walls, school pictures, family vacations to the lake, birthday parties, a life built on love, not money. Richard found David in the garage working on an old lawnmower. David looked up, saw Richard, and his expression hardened. He didn't stop working. "What are you doing here, sir?" Richard stepped closer, hands in his pockets. "I came to apologize." David laughed bitterly, still focused on the lawnmower. "You already did that. I came to apologize the right way." David finally stopped and looked at him. "And what's the right way, Mr. Cole? Throwing money at it? Writing a check to make yourself feel better?" Richard shook his head. "No. The right way is to tell you that I was wrong. Not just about the test, but about everything. About the way I've lived my life. The way I've looked at people. I've spent so many years protecting myself from being hurt that I forgot what it means to actually trust someone, and in doing that, I hurt the one person who never gave me a reason to doubt him." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I watched the footage, David. All of it. I saw you praying in the car. I saw you bring me soup when I said I wasn't hungry. I saw you fix my blanket when you thought I was asleep. And I found out about the orphanage, about the donations you've been making in my name." David's face flushed. "That wasn't for you to find out about. I know, but I did, and it made me realize that I don't deserve your loyalty. I never did. You gave it freely, and I treated it like it was something to be tested and measured." David set down the wrench he was holding and crossed his arms. "So what now? You want me to come back? Pretend none of this happened?" Richard shook his head. "No, I don't expect you to come back. I don't expect your forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I see you now. I see what you did. And I'm sorry. Not because I got caught, but because I hurt someone who deserved better." The garage was silent except for the distant sound of kids playing in a neighbor's yard. David exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping. You really thought I'd steal from you? Richard nodded, his voice breaking. Yes, and I was wrong. So completely, painfully wrong. David looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. I don't know if I can trust you again, Mr. Cole. Richard nodded. I understand. But I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to be the kind of man you thought I was. The kind of man who deserves the loyalty you showed me. David didn't respond. He just turned back to the lawnmower. Richard took that as his cue to leave, but as he reached the door, David's voice stopped him. Mr. Cole. Richard turned. David didn't look at him, but his voice was quieter now. I'll think about it. Richard nodded, tears stinging his eyes. Thank you. And he left. Over the next 2 months, Richard began to change his life in ways that shocked everyone who knew him. He reached out to his children, not with money or business propositions, but with genuine attempts at reconciliation. He apologized for the years of distance, for prioritizing his empire over his family. His oldest daughter was skeptical at first, but slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild something fragile and real. He started volunteering at the orphanage on Maple Street, the one David had been supporting. He didn't announce it. He didn't bring cameras or publicists. He just showed up, rolled up his sleeves, and helped. He read to the kids. He repaired broken playground equipment. He listened to the director talk about the needs of the facility, and then, quietly, he began to fund those needs. Not for recognition, but because David had shown him that legacy wasn't about buildings with your name on them. It was about the lives you touched when no one was watching. And every week, Richard wrote David a letter, not asking him to come back, not defending himself, just updating him on the changes he was making, telling him about the kids at the orphanage, sharing small moments of growth and reflection. He didn't know if David was reading them, but he kept writing. Then, one Saturday morning, Richard arrived at the orphanage to find David there. He was playing basketball with a group of kids in the courtyard, laughing as they teased him about his terrible free throws. Richard stopped in his tracks. David saw him and paused. The kids ran off to get water, and the two men stood facing each other across the court. David spoke first. The director told me you've been coming here, every week. Richard nodded. I have. David looked around at the freshly painted building, the new basketball hoops, the repaired fence. You didn't have to do all this. Richard's voice was quiet. Yes, I did. David studied him for a long moment, then walked closer. You know, I didn't think you'd actually change. I thought you'd throw some money around and move on. Richard smiled sadly. I thought about that, but I realized that's what the old me would have done. And the old me lost the best friend he ever had. David's expression softened. You're really trying. Richard nodded. Every day. David was quiet for a moment, then extended his hand. I'm not saying everything's fine. I'm not saying I completely trust you yet, but I'm willing to try. If you are. Richard took his hand, gripping it firmly. I am. And for the first time in months, Richard felt like he could breathe again. 6 months later, Richard received news that would put everything into perspective. He was sitting in his doctor's office, the real one this time, when the words hit him like a freight train. I'm sorry, Richard. It's lung cancer. Stage 3. We caught it late. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had faked a terminal illness to test a man's loyalty, and now he actually was dying. Richard sat in his car in the parking lot for an hour, staring at nothing. He thought about calling his children. He thought about calling Martin. But the first person he called was David. David answered on the second ring. Mr. Cole? Hey. Richard's voice cracked. Can you come get me? I'm at the medical center. Is everything okay? Richard closed his eyes. No, but I need you. 30 minutes later, David pulled up in the old black car, the same one he'd been driving for years. He got out and opened the door for Richard without a word. As they drove in silence, Richard finally spoke. It's real this time. David glanced at him in the rearview mirror. What is? The illness. I actually have cancer." The car slowed slightly, then continued. David's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "How long?" 3 to 6 months. Maybe more if treatment works. But the odds aren't great." David pulled over to the side of the road and turned around in his seat. His eyes were red. "You're serious?" Richard nodded. "Completely." David stared at him, and then, to Richard's shock, he started laughing. Not cruelly, but the kind of exhausted, disbelieving laughter that comes when the universe reveals its sense of humor. Richard, despite everything, found himself laughing too. I know. It's ridiculous." David wiped his eyes. God has a twisted sense of timing. Richard nodded. He really does. David took a breath, then looked Richard in the eye. "Okay, then we do this right. No more lies, no more tests. You tell me what you need, and I'll be there." Richard felt tears streaming down his face. "You don't have to do this. After everything I put you through." David shook his head. "Yes, I do, because that's what family does." And in that moment, Richard understood. David wasn't staying because of obligation. He wasn't staying because he hoped to gain something. He was staying because love, real love, doesn't keep score. It doesn't test. It just shows up. Richard reached forward and gripped David's shoulder. "Thank you." David nodded, then turned back around and started the car. They drove home in silence, but it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It was the silence of two men who had been through fire and come out the other side, scarred but whole. Richard spent his final months living in a way he never had before. He was present. He was honest. He was vulnerable. David drove him to chemotherapy appointments, sat with him during the hard days, and celebrated with him during the small victories. Richard's children visited more often, and slowly the walls that had separated them began to crumble. Richard told them about the test he had put David through and about what he had learned. His daughter cried. His sons were angry at first, but eventually they understood. Their father was finally letting them see him, not as the untouchable billionaire, but as a flawed, frightened man trying to make things right before the end. Richard also spent time at the orphanage, even when he was too weak to do much more than sit and talk with the kids. They didn't care about his money or his empire. They just liked that he remembered their names and asked about their drawings. One afternoon, Richard asked David to take him to his lawyer's office one last time. "Martin, I need to make some changes to my will." Martin nodded, pulling out the documents. "What are you thinking?" Richard glanced at David, who was waiting outside in the hallway, then back at Martin. "I want to establish a foundation. The majority of my estate will go into it. It'll fund the orphanage, provide scholarships for kids who grew up without families, and support programs that help people who are struggling. And I want David to run it." Martin raised an eyebrow. "David? Are you sure? He doesn't have experience managing that kind of money." Richard smiled. "He has something better. He has integrity, and he understands what it means to give without expecting anything in return. I'll set up advisors to help him with the logistics. But the decisions, the heart of it, that's his." Martin nodded slowly. "All right. I'll draft it. What about your children?" Richard had already talked to them. They'll be taken care of. They'll receive enough to live comfortably. But the bulk of it goes to the foundation. They've agreed. Martin looked at Richard with something close to pride. "You've changed, old friend." Richard's smile was sad. "I just finally figured out what actually matters." 3 weeks later, Richard passed away in his sleep. David was there, sitting in the chair beside his bed, just like he had been every night for the past month. When the monitors went silent, David didn't cry right away. He just sat there, holding Richard's hand, whispering a prayer for a man who had tested him, broken him, and ultimately taught him that even the richest man in the world can be poor in the ways that matter most. Richard's funeral was attended by hundreds. Business leaders, politicians, family, and friends filled the cathedral, but it was David's eulogy that people remembered. He stood at the podium, hands shaking slightly, and spoke from the heart. Richard Cole was not a perfect man. He made mistakes. He hurt people. He spent years building walls around his heart because he was afraid of being betrayed. But in his final months, he did something most people never do. He changed. He admitted he was wrong. He asked for forgiveness. And he spent every day trying to be better than he was the day before. He taught me that loyalty isn't about blind obedience. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. It's about seeing someone at their worst and choosing to believe they can be better. And he taught me that wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the lives you touch and the love you leave behind. I'll miss him. Not because he was my employer, but because in the end, he became my friend. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the service, Martin pulled David aside and handed him a sealed envelope. "Richard wanted you to have this." David opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. "David, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I hope I died knowing I made things right between us. I'm leaving you in charge of the foundation, not because I think you owe me anything, but because you're the only person I trust to do it right. You showed me that goodness doesn't need recognition, that loyalty doesn't need reward, and that a man's true wealth is found in the people who stand by him when he has nothing left to offer. Thank you for staying. Thank you for forgiving me. And thank you for showing me what it means to be rich in the ways that matter. Your friend, Richard." David folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He looked out at the crowd dispersing, at the orphanage director who had come to pay her respects, at Richard's children who were finally talking to each other without arguing. And he realized that Richard's final test hadn't been for him. It had been for Richard himself. A test to see if a man who had spent his whole life chasing wealth could learn, in the end, that the richest life is the one you give away. David continued to drive the same old car. He refused the luxury office Martin offered him for the foundation. Instead, he worked out of a small room at the orphanage, surrounded by the kids Richard had grown to love. The foundation grew. Scholarships were given, families were helped, and every year, on the anniversary of Richard's death, David would visit his grave and leave a single note that read, "You were right, sir. Loyalty doesn't need a test. It just needs a chance." So let me ask you this. If you were Richard, standing at the end of your life, looking back at the people you tested, the walls you built, the love you kept at arm's length because you were afraid of being hurt, what would you change? And if you were David, would you have stayed? Would you have forgiven? Or would you have walked away and never looked back? The truth is, we all test people in small ways. We hold back trust until we're sure. We protect our hearts until someone proves they won't break them. But what Richard learned, and what David showed him, is that real connection requires risk. It requires vulnerability. It requires believing that not everyone is out to take something from you. Some people are just there because they care, and sometimes the richest thing you can do is let them in. Richard Cole spent his entire life building an empire, but it took a dying man's honesty to show him that the greatest wealth isn't what you accumulate, it's what you give away freely and the people who stand beside you when you have nothing left to prove. David didn't stay because he was waiting for an inheritance. He stayed because 15 years of small moments, of shared silence, of mutual respect, had built something that couldn't be bought or tested. He stayed because that's what love does. Not romantic love, not transactional love, but the kind of love that says, "I see you at your worst, and I'm still here." The kind that doesn't ask what's in it for me, but asks, "What do you need?" And in the end, that's what broke Richard. Not the test results, not the hidden cameras, but the realization that while he was busy trying to catch David being human, David was busy being exactly who he'd always been: loyal, kind, present, unwavering. Think about the people in your own life, the ones you take for granted, the ones who show up without fanfare, without expectation, without keeping score. Have you tested them in ways they don't even know about? Have you held back trust because you're afraid of being disappointed? Or worse, have you pushed them away entirely because you convinced yourself that everyone wants something? Richard's story is a mirror, and what it reflects isn't always comfortable. It shows us that we often wound the people who love us most, not because they've done anything wrong, but because we're terrified of being vulnerable. We test instead of trust. We question instead of accept. We build walls instead of bridges. And by the time we realize what we've lost, it's sometimes too late to get it back. But here's the beautiful, painful truth that Richard discovered in his final months. It's never too late to change. It's never too late to say I was wrong. It's never too late to tear down the walls and let people see you, really see you, in all your brokenness and fear and desperate need for connection. David could have walked away. He had every right to. Richard had humiliated him, manipulated him, and broken his trust in the most fundamental way. But David chose forgiveness, not because Richard deserved it, but because David understood something Richard was only beginning to learn. Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about refusing to let bitterness poison your own heart. It's about choosing love even when love has been tested and found wanting. It's about believing that people can change, that redemption is real, and that the hardest person to extend grace to is often the one who needs it most. And Richard did change. Not overnight, not perfectly, but consistently, deliberately, humbly. He showed up at the orphanage week after week. He wrote letters he wasn't sure would be read. He rebuilt relationships with his children, one painful conversation at a time. He stopped performing and started being present, and in doing so, he discovered what David had known all along. That the best things in life, the things that actually fill the emptiness inside, can't be controlled or measured or tested. They can only be received with open hands and a grateful heart. The foundation that David runs today has helped thousands of kids. Kids who grew up like David's own children, without much money, but with an abundance of love. Kids who grew up like the ones at the orphanage, without families, but with a desperate need to know they matter. And every scholarship, every program, every life changed carries Richard's name, but it's powered by David's heart. That's the legacy, not the buildings or the bank accounts or the business empire that was eventually sold off and dissolved. The legacy is the man who learned too late that wealth without love is just a pile of empty things, and the man who taught him that love without conditions is the only wealth that endures. So where are you watching from? Are you watching from a place of walls and tests and protected hearts? Or are you watching from a place of open hands and vulnerable trust? Drop a comment and let me know. Because this story isn't just about Richard and David. It's about all of us. It's about every relationship we've sabotaged because we were afraid. Every person we've pushed away because we didn't think we deserved their loyalty. Every moment we've chosen safety over connection. And here's what I want you to take away from this. If Richard, a man who spent 68 years building walls, could learn to tear them down in his final months, then so can you. If David, a man who had every reason to walk away, could choose forgiveness and reconciliation, then so can you. It's not too late. It's never too late. Call the person you've been testing. Apologize to the one you've hurt. Let down your guard with someone who's been waiting patiently on the other side of your walls. Because the saddest thing in the world isn't dying rich and alone. It's living rich and alone, surrounded by things instead of people, by success instead of love, by the empire you built to protect yourself from the very connection you were desperate for all along. Richard died with people around him, real people who loved him, not for what he could give them, but for who he'd finally allowed himself to be. Flawed, scared, repentant, human, and in the end, that made him richer than he'd ever been when he was counting billions. David still visits Richard's grave, not out of obligation, but because he misses his friend, the man Richard became, the man who finally understood that the greatest test in life isn't whether other people will pass ours. It's whether we'll have the courage to stop testing and start trusting, to stop performing and start connecting, to stop building empires and start building relationships. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's what Richard learned and what David knew all along. Love isn't something you earn or prove or test. It's something you give freely and receive gratefully. And when you find someone who gives it without asking for anything in return, you hold on to them. Not with suspicion or surveillance or secret tests, but with open arms and a humble heart, and the quiet acknowledgement that you've been given a gift most people spend their whole lives searching for. So let me leave you with this final thought. What if the person you're testing right now is actually the person who's going to teach you what it means to be truly wealthy? What if the loyalty you're questioning is the very thing that could save you from the loneliness you're trying so hard to avoid? What if, like Richard, you're building walls around the one relationship that could actually set you free? Think about it. Sit with it. And maybe, just maybe, make a different choice. The choice to trust. The choice to be vulnerable. The choice to believe that not everyone is out to hurt you, and that some people, the rare and precious ones, will stay even when you give them every reason to leave. Because that's what David did, and that's what changed everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships differently, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss stories that challenge you to live better, love deeper, and build a legacy that actually matters. And in the comments, tell me, would you have stayed if you were David, or would you have walked away? I read every single comment, and I want to know what you think. Because your story matters too. Your choices matter, and the way you love the people in your life matters more than any test you could ever design. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for being willing to sit with a story that's uncomfortable and beautiful and painfully true. Until next time, remember that the richest life isn't the one with the most money. It's the one with the most love. And love, real love, doesn't need a test. It just needs a chance.